The final nail in the coffin of Ilara's old life was not a nail at all, but the sharp, decisive click of a latch. Josiah, her husband's brother, closed the door to the house she had shared with Thomas, his face a mask of grim duty. Through the wavy glass pane, his form blurred into a smudge of black broadcloth and unforgiving principle. He did not look back. The life she knew was now on the other side of that wood and glass, and she was on this side, with the dust of the Providence Gulch road on her worn boots and the weight of nothing in her hands. Thomas was gone, claimed by a collapsing seam of rock in the silver mine that had promised everyone a fortune and delivered mostly heartache. He had been a man of gentle dreams and poor ledgers. His brother Josiah was a man of hard numbers and harder truths. The hardest truth of all was that Thomas had left nothing behind but debts and one single, solitary asset, a deed written in his hopeful scrawl for a piece of land everyone knew was worthless. It was 5 miles north of town, a wind-swept parcel of rock and scrub called the Scour for the way the winter winds stripped it bare of soil, snow, and hope. Josiah had pressed 20 silver dollars into her palm. "This is a kindness, Ilara," he had said, his voice devoid of any. "It clears Thomas's accounts at the mercantile. The land is yours, as the law dictates. What you do now is your own affair." His wife, a pale woman who had once been Ilara's friend, stood behind him, her hands twisting in her apron, her eyes fixed on the floorboards. The town watched. They always watched. From behind parted curtains and from the porches of their sturdy log homes, they saw the widow cast out. Their faces held a mixture of pity and a quiet, ugly satisfaction that it was her tragedy and not their own. What she had left could be counted on one hand: the deed to the Scour, $20, the clothes she wore, and Boulder, Thomas's dog, a great silent beast of indeterminate breed, with a graying muzzle and eyes that held a steady, mournful loyalty. He sat at her feet now, his heavy body pressed against her leg, a warm, living anchor in a world that had just been swept away. He was all that remained of Thomas's gentle heart. Mr. Gable, the owner of the mercantile and the town's self-appointed arbiter of common sense, saw her standing there. He came out onto his porch, wiping his hands on his apron. "A sorry business, Ilara, a sorry business. Josiah is a hard man, but he has a family to think of." He squinted at the horizon. "You'll be heading east, I suppose, to your people?" Ilara's people were 5 years gone, taken by the fever. Gable knew this. It was not a question. It was a dismissal. "No," Ilara said. Her voice was raw, unused. "The land is mine." Gable almost laughed. He caught himself turning it into a cough. "The Scour? Child, nothing grows there. Nothing lives there. The wind would peel the skin from your bones. It's a place on a map, not a place for living. Sell the deed for a pittance. Buy a coach ticket. There's nothing for you here." For a long moment, Ilara looked at the door Josiah had closed. She looked at the faces in the windows. She saw not concern, but a tidy closing of a chapter. They were erasing her, sweeping her away like dust. A cold, hard thing settled in her chest, something that felt less like grief and more like granite. She turned from the house and walked toward the mercantile, Boulder padding silently at her side. She placed her $20 on the worn wooden counter. "I'll need a good axe," she said, her voice clear and steady, "a shovel, a crosscut saw, and what's left in salt, flour, and beans." Gable stared at the coins, then at her face. He saw the foolishness of it, the sheer, doomed madness. But he also saw something else in her eyes, a flat, unyielding resolve that startled him. He sighed, the sound of a man bowing to the inevitable folly of others, and began to gather her things. As she walked out of town, the heavy axe balanced on her shoulder and a sack of supplies on her back. She did not look back. She faced north toward the barren hills and walked into the wind. The journey to the scour was a pilgrimage into purgatory. The 5 miles stretched into an eternity of dust and sharp rock. The path dwindled from a wagon track to a game trail, and finally, to nothing at all. The land grew harsher with every step. The sparse pines and aspens of the lower valley gave way to stunted, wind-twisted shrubs, and then, finally, to bare stone and gravel. Boulder stayed close, his head low, as if he too could feel the land's profound, inhospitable nature. The weight of the tools cut into Alara's shoulders, and the sack of flour felt like a bag of stones, but she did not stop. To stop was to admit that Gable and Josiah and all of them were right. When she finally crested the last rise, she saw it. It was worse than the stories. It was a scar on the face of the earth, a long, sloping hillside of gray rock and shale, utterly devoid of life. The wind was a constant physical presence here, a low moan that vibrated in her bones. In the center of the slope was a shallow alcove, a concave depression in the rock face no deeper than a wagon bed, with a rock overhang above it. This, she knew, was the heart of her inheritance. This was the place Thomas had dreamed of building a summer cabin, a place to escape the town's noise. He had seen romance in its desolation. She saw only a tomb. The moment of despair was a physical blow. Her knees buckled, and she sank to the ground, the heavy sack thudding beside her. Tears she had refused to shed in town now came, hot and stinging, whipped away by the relentless wind as soon as they touched her cheeks. The town was right. The world was right. This was a place to die, not to live. Boulder pushed his great head under her hand, whining softly, his warm presence the only comfort in the vast, cold emptiness. For a long, hollow hour she sat there, the full weight of her hopelessness pressing down on her like the stone of the mountain itself. She was alone, with a dog and an axe, on a piece of the world God had forgotten to finish. But the sun was sinking, and the cold was beginning to bite with real teeth. Survival was a more immediate tyrant than despair. She had to have a fire. She stumbled to her feet, her body aching, and began to gather the few pieces of dry, gnarled brush that clung to life in the crevices of the rocks. She carried them into the shallow shelter of the alcove, a place that offered only the barest respite from the wind. She used her shovel to clear a small circle of gravel down to the packed earth, intending to build a fire pit. The shovel scraped rock, as expected. But then, on the third scoop, it plunged downward with a soft, sucking sound. It was not rock. She stopped, her breath catching. She dug again, her movements frantic now. Beneath a thin layer of shale and dust was a thick, deep vein of something else. It was a pale, greasy earth, cool and pliable in her hands. She squeezed it, and it held its shape. It was clay. Not the red, gritty clay of the riverbeds, but a smooth, fine-grained, almost white clay. A memory surfaced, sharp and clear as a winter morning. Her father, a brickmaker from the old country, his hands always pale with dust. He was holding a piece of earth just like this. Kyolin, he had called it, the heart of the mountain. It holds fire like a lover's promise. Bricks made from this earth don't just build a wall, they build a hearth. They hold the heat long after the flame is gone. As the words echoed in her mind, she felt something else. The sun, now low on the horizon, had been shining on the great stone face of the mountain all afternoon. She placed a hand against the back wall of the alcove. It was warm, not hot, but a deep, resonant warmth that radiated from the very stone itself. The rock had been drinking the sunlight all day, holding it, and the wind. She stood at the mouth of the alcove and felt it rush past her, a torrent of cold air. But inside, the air was still. The shape of the hollow, which had seemed so uselessly shallow, was just deep enough to shear the wind, forcing it up and over the overhang. It was a natural shield. Despair did not vanish. It was too vast, too honest. But it was joined by something else, something fierce and sharp, a grim resolve. This place was not a tomb, it was a challenge. The land had not given her shelter, but it had given her the materials to build it. It had given her stone, a shield from the wind, a deep and abiding thermal mass, and the finest clay a builder could ever pray for. The town saw a worthless hole. Her father would have seen a kiln. Elara stood up, her back straight, and picked up her axe. The work would be brutal. It might kill her, but she would not lie down and die. She would build. The first task was to deepen the world she had been given. The alcove was a mere suggestion of a home, a shallow scoop in the rock. With the shovel and a heavy iron pry bar she fashioned from a shattered piece of mining equipment found wedged in a ravine, she began to attack the hillside. The work was a symphony of agony. Each shovelful of shale and packed earth was a negotiation with the mountain. Her hands, soft from a life of mending and baking, were raw by the end of the first day. Blisters formed, broke, and bled, leaving weeping sores that caked with dirt. Her shoulders and back screamed with a fire that never went out, a dull, constant burn that became the new language of her body. She did not think of the town. She did not think of Josiah. She thought only of the next rock to be moved, the next shovelful of earth. Her world shrank to the scrape of metal on stone, the grunt of effort, the sting of sweat in her eyes. Boulder watched her, a silent, worried sentinel, occasionally nudging her hand with his wet nose as if to remind her to rest. Rest was a luxury. Winter was not a suggestion. It was a deadline, a predator stalking the calendar. Every day of sun was a gift to be exploited until exhaustion claimed her. She dug not for inches, but for feet, carving a level floor deeper into the mountain's embrace, extending the shelter from a shallow alcove into a proper room, a space that felt less like a cave and more like a foundation. While she dug, she made bricks. She hauled water in a salvage bucket from a seep she discovered a quarter-mile down the slope, a slow, steady drip of clear, cold water that was another of the mountain's secrets. She mixed the pale kaolin clay with water and the dry, fibrous grasses that grew in tough clumps among the rocks. She stomped it with her bare feet until it was a thick, consistent paste. Then, using a simple wooden frame she built, she formed brick after messy brick, laying them out in long rows under the relentless sun. They were crude, uneven things, but as they baked hard and pale in the heat, they felt more precious to her than gold. They were the building blocks of her survival. In a ravine a half-mile away, hidden from the wind, she found a small, defiant grove of ironwood trees. They were stunted, gnarled things, twisted by a lifetime of struggle, but their wood was dense and hard as stone. Felling the first one was a battle of wills. The new axe was sharp, but she was unskilled. Her swings were clumsy, her aim poor. The tree seemed to mock her, absorbing her frantic blows with stoic indifference. It took her the better part of a day to bring it down, and when it finally fell with a groaning crack, she collapsed beside it, her arms trembling with a fatigue so deep it felt like paralysis. Getting the logs back up the slope to her building site was another trial by fire. She had no mule, no wagon. She had only her own body and a length of rope. She learned to use the terrain, rolling the logs, levering them with her pry bar, dragging them a few feet at a time in a grueling, repetitive dance of leverage and brute force. With a foundation dug and a small pile of logs and bricks, she began to build the front wall that would seal her shelter from the world. She laid a course of the largest, flattest stones she could find, setting them in a thick bed of her wet clay mortar. Then a course of her pale bricks, then another of stone. The wall rose with agonizing slowness, a crooked, uneven testament to her desperation. Each stone had to be lifted, settled, and checked. Each gap had to be chinked with smaller stones and packed tight with clay. It was a puzzle with pieces that weighed 50 pounds each. But as it grew, it began to change the space behind it. It blocked the wind. It cast a shadow. It turned a hollow into an enclosure. It began to feel like a home. She knew, however, that stone and clay were not enough. The cold of this high country was a living thing. It would find every crack, every seam. It would leach the warmth from the thickest wall. She needed more. She needed insulation. And she had an idea born of memory and desperation, an idea that would require her to leave the lonely sovereignty of her mountain and return to the world that had cast her out. She needed wool. Walking back into Providence Gulch was like walking into a dream of a past life. The town was the same, but she was different. She was caked in dust and clay, her face leaner, her hands calloused and scarred. Her clothes were frayed, her hair a wild tangle. The townspeople stared. Whispers followed her like a cloud of flies. She was no longer the pitiable widow. She was something wilder, something stranger. They saw the madness in her, the folly Mr. Gable had predicted. She ignored them. She walked past the mercantile, past the closed door of her old home, to the edge of town where a rancher named Davies kept a small flock of hardy sheep. She found him mending a fence. He looked up, his eyes widening in surprise. She didn't waste time with pleasantries. She pulled the last of her material wealth from her pocket, Thomas's silver pocket watch. It was his one small vanity, a beautiful, intricate thing. "I need 3 ewes," she said, holding it out. "Hardy ones. The ones you'd cull before winter." Davies looked at the watch, then at her. He knew its value. He also knew the value of 3 old ewes. It was not an equal trade, but he saw the stark need in her eyes. He nodded slowly, a flicker of something, pity perhaps, or a grudging respect, in his expression. "Take your pick," he said, gesturing to a small pen. The journey back to the scour with 3 stubborn, bleating sheep was a fresh kind of hell. But as she led them up the final slope, they were a sign of life in the desolate landscape. As she passed the edge of town, she saw Mr. Gable on his porch. He watched her lead the small flock, his face a mixture of disbelief and amusement. He called out, his voice carrying on the wind, sharp and clear. "Going to knit yourself a house, Elara?" A few men loafing nearby chuckled. The joke was a good one. It confirmed everything they thought they knew. She was the mad widow on the hill, trying to build a house of wool. The name stuck. Back at her homestead, she built a small, sturdy lean-to for the sheep against the eastern side of her growing house, sharing a common wall. They would be sheltered from the north wind, and their body heat would contribute, in some small way, to the warmth of the main structure. Then, with a pair of rusty shears she had bought with the last of her change, she sheared them. The wool was thick, greasy, and heavy with lanolin. It was perfect. This was the heart of her plan, the secret ingredient born from her desperate calculations. As she built the final courses of her front wall, she built it as 2 separate skins of stone, a few inches apart. Into this cavity, she began to pack the raw wool, stuffing it down with a stick until it was a dense, tight mass. The lanolin would help repel moisture, and the trapped air in the fibers would create a barrier against the cold that no log wall could ever match. She also began mixing chopped up wool into her clay mixture for the mortar and for a new batch of bricks. These composite bricks were lighter, and when she tested one on her fire, she found it held the heat even better than the pure clay ones. It was an absurd, unheard-of technique. It was a madwoman's architecture. She built her fireplace against the solid rock of the back wall, a great deep hearth made of her finest clay and wool bricks. The mountain itself would be her fireback, a colossal thermal battery that would soak up the heat and radiate it back into the room long after the flames died down. The chimney was a tricky, dangerous piece of work, a leaning tower of stone and clay that she built from the inside out, praying it would draw true. Boulder was her constant shadow through all of this. He guarded the sheep from coyotes, his low growl a perimeter of sound in the night. He slept at the foot of her cot, a warm, breathing presence that kept the crushing loneliness at bay. He was the keeper of her sanity, the one living thing to whom she did not have to justify her existence. When she spoke, it was to him, her voice a low murmur, as she described the day's work, the angle of a stone, the feel of the coming cold. He would watch her, his head cocked, his tail giving a slow, steady thump against the dirt floor. Finally, the day came when the last stone was set, the last gap chinked. She had fashioned a door from the thickest ironwood planks, hung on leather hinges. A small window opening was covered with a piece of stretched, oiled hide that let in a dim, murky light. From the outside, it was a strange, almost alien structure. It did not look like a house. It looked like a part of the mountain that had grown a wall, a low, solid, almost windowless mound of rock and pale earth hunkered down against the hillside. It was ugly, it was defiant, it was home. That night she built the first fire in the great hearth. The chimney drew perfectly, pulling the smoke up and away. The stone of the mountain began to drink the warmth, and for the first time in months, Elara slept through the night, safe from the wind. The story of Elara's folly became a staple of conversation in Providence Gulch. The name they had for her place, the Wool-Packed Walls, was said with a smirk. It was a joke, a piece of local folklore in the making. Mr. Gable was the chief storyteller. Using wool for insulation, he'd scoff to the men gathered around the stove in his mercantile. The damp will get in, it'll rot and stink. The whole thing will be a frozen, moldy mess by Christmas. A proper log cabin, well chinked. That's what stands up to the winter. That's sense. Everyone would nod in agreement. It was the way things were done. A hunter named Brant, a man who prided himself on his rugged competence, made a point to ride past the scour on his way to the high country for trapping. He reined in his horse and stared at Elara's creation. She was on the roof, adding a thick layer of sod over the log beams, when he called out. "That's a brave effort, missus," he said, though his tone was anything but admiring. "But that clay will melt in the first big rain. And wool? In a wall? You'd have been better off knitting a blanket." He laughed, a hearty, confident sound that the wind snatched away. Elara said nothing. She simply watched him until he rode on, then turned back to her work, carefully placing the next square of earth and grass. His words meant nothing. The wall was the only truth that mattered. As autumn deepened, the rhythm of her life settled into a simple, repetitive pattern. Her world was small, but it was entirely her own. The day began before dawn, with the tending of the fire. She would add logs she had spent weeks cutting and stockpiling, a small mountain of fuel that represented hundreds of hours of brutal labor. She would milk the ewes, their warm bodies a comfort in the chill air. She would check her snares, set for the rabbits that lived in the rocky crevices. She would spend hours maintaining her home, patching the clay mortar where small cracks appeared, ensuring every seam was sealed tight against the coming cold. She was utterly alone, yet she did not feel the sharp edge of loneliness she had felt in town. Here, her solitude was a companion, not a punishment. Her life was measured in tangible things: the height of the woodpile, the number of preserved rabbit pelts, the sacks of dried beans and flour stacked against the far wall. This small, warm space she had carved from the mountain was a kingdom of one, and she was its sovereign. The wind could howl, the town could mock, but inside these walls she was safe. Inside these walls she was the one who was right. The first tests of her creation came not from the great cold, but from its lesser cousins. An early autumn storm rolled in, a 3-day deluge of cold, driving rain. In town, the rain found its way into barns and homes, turning dirt floors to mud and exposing poorly chinked logs. At the scour, Elara watched as the water streamed over her sod roof and down the stone walls. Her clay, baked hard by the sun and the constant heat from her hearth, held fast. Not a single drop made it inside. The house stood like a boulder in a river, impervious and unmoving. Later, as the nights grew colder, a pack of coyotes, emboldened by hunger, grew brave. They tested the small fence of her sheep pen, their yips and howls a frantic chorus in the darkness. But the pen was built against the solid wall of the house, and Boulder met their intrusion with a ferocity that startled even Alara. He was not a town dog anymore. He was a guardian, a defender of this small patch of life, and his deep-chested, savage barks sent the predators scattering back into the rocks. Each small victory was a confirmation. Her systems worked. She was not just surviving, she was prevailing. The mockery of the town felt distant, irrelevant, the babbling of people who did not understand the language of the mountain. The first snows were a gentle dusting, a pretty warning. But then, in the heart of January, the real winter arrived. It came not as a storm, but as an invasion. The people of Providence Gulch would later call it the Great Freeze of '83. It began with a wind that was different from the usual bluster. This wind had a voice, a high, screaming keen that sounded like tearing metal. It came from the north, a solid wall of Arctic air that felt like a physical blow. The temperature plummeted not by degrees but by tens of degrees. Ink froze in wells. Exposed metal seared the skin on contact. The world went silent, save for the shriek of the wind and the sharp crack of trees splitting open in the killing cold. For Alara, the change was dramatic but not terrifying. Outside her wool-packed walls, the world had become an alien planet, a landscape of absolute hostility. The air itself was a weapon, but inside, her small world held. The great stone mountain at her back, saturated with weeks of heat from the fireplace, now radiated a steady, gentle warmth. The thick, insulated walls did not transmit the cold, they defeated it. The wind screamed and clawed at the stone, but it could not find purchase. It flowed over her low, rounded roof like water over a stone. She could hear its fury, a distant, muffled roar, but she could not feel its teeth. Her fire burned hot and steady. The sheep were calm in their lean-to, their bodies huddled together, shielded from the icy blast. Boulder slept by the hearth, his flank rising and falling in a steady rhythm. She was not fighting the storm. She was living outside of its reach, an island of warmth and order in a world consumed by frozen chaos. In Providence Gulch, the world was breaking apart. The log cabins, the symbols of frontier strength, were failing. The cold was a patient thief, finding every tiny gap in the chinking, every crack around a window frame. It crept across floors and down walls, a tangible presence of numbing cold. Families huddled around their fireplaces, burning through their wood piles at a ferocious rate. But much of the wood was green, cut late in the season, and it sputtered and smoked, giving off little heat. Roofs, heavy with frozen snow, groaned under the strain. The great bell in the town's meeting hall cracked with a sound like a gunshot, silenced by the impossible cold. Mr. Gable's mercantile, with its large glass windows, was an ice house. His confidence, his certainty in the old ways, shattered like his own window panes. The town's preparations, their collective wisdom, had collapsed. Their pride had frozen solid and was now crumbling to dust. They were trapped, freezing in the very homes they had believed would protect them. On the third day of the freeze, when the world was a white blur of wind and ice, Alara heard a sound that was not the storm. It was a frantic, desperate banging on her heavy wood door. Boulder was on his feet in an instant, a low growl rumbling in his chest. Alara quieted him with a hand on his back. No animal made a sound like that. It was human. She braced herself and lifted the heavy bar securing the door. The wind tore the door from her grasp, slamming it inward. A figure, more a sculpture of ice and snow than a man, collapsed onto her floor. It was Brant, the hunter who had laughed at her. His face was a waxy, dead-white mask, of frostbite. His hands were frozen into useless claws. He was delirious, muttering about his camp, about the cold, his words lost in a frozen exhalation. He had been caught in the high country, his tent and supplies ripped away by the first blast of the storm. He had tried to make it back to town, a journey that was now impossible. He had seen a light, a faint, impossible orange glow in the blizzard, and had stumbled towards it, believing it to be a hallucination, before he collapsed at its source. The choice was not a choice at all. It was an imperative. This was a human being, dying on her floor. The memory of his mockery, his condescending laughter, was a ghost, a flicker of heat in the cold reality of the moment. It did not matter. She and Boulder dragged him inside, fighting to force the door shut against the storm's fury. She cut away his frozen clothes, her hands stinging from the cold that clung to him. She packed his frost-bitten hands and feet in snow, the old way to draw the frost out without causing more damage. She forced warm broth, spoonful by spoonful, between his cracked lips. She used her precious resources, her firewood, her food, her strength, on the man who had called her a fool. Not because he deserved it, but because she could. It was the law of the mountain, a law more fundamental than any spoken in town. You helped who you could. Brant awoke hours later to a sensation he thought he'd never feel again. Deep, profound warmth. He was lying on a pallet of furs near a great roaring fire. The air was warm and still. He heard the gentle bleating of sheep. He blinked, his eyes struggling to focus. He saw the thick, uneven stone walls, the low, sod-covered ceiling. He saw Ilara, her face calm, stirring a pot over the fire. He could not reconcile this place, this warm, safe, living place, with the frozen hell outside. He pushed himself up on one elbow, his body screaming in protest. "How?" he croaked, his voice a dry rasp. "This place, it's warm." Ilara looked at him. She did not smile. She did not gloat. "The mountain holds the heat," she said simply, "and the walls are packed with wool." Brant stared at the wall, his eyes wide with a dawning, horrified understanding. Wool, the thing he had mocked. The joke of the town. It was not folly, it was genius. He saw the logic of it now, the simple, profound brilliance of her design. He, the expert hunter, the man of the wilderness, had nearly died in a canvas tent. She, the mad widow, was living in a fortress of warmth. He lay back down, shame and awe washing over him in equal measure. He had been so wrong. The storm did not relent. Later that day there was another desperate banging at the door. This time, when Ilara opened it, she found Mr. Gable. His face was a mask of frozen tears and terror. He was not alone. Huddled behind him were his wife and his small son, who was wrapped in every blanket they owned. The boy was coughing, a weak, shallow sound that spoke of a deep sickness in his lungs. "Help us," Gable pleaded, his voice breaking. "Our house, it's as cold as the grave. The fire won't stay lit. My boy, he's burning with fever, but he's freezing to death. We saw the smoke from your chimney. We didn't believe it could be real." He looked past her, into the impossible warmth of her home. He saw Brant, alive, propped up near the fire. His eyes, the eyes of a man whose entire world of certainties had just been obliterated, filled with a stunned, desperate hope. Ilara simply stood back and held the door open for them. She helped Gable's wife, Martha, bring the sick child inside, settling him on her own cot, the warmest place in the house. Gable stumbled in after them, his body shivering uncontrollably as the warmth hit him. He looked at the solid walls, the massive hearth, the calm animals in their pen, visible through a small interior opening she had made. He saw the quiet, life-sustaining order of it all. He looked at Ilara, this woman he had dismissed, mocked and pitied. His face crumpled. The pride that had been the bedrock of his character dissolved into raw, humbling shame. "We were wrong," he whispered, the words catching in his throat. He looked at Brant, then back at Ilara. "We called you a fool. We laughed at your wool-packed walls." He choked back a sob. "My God, we were the fools. We were the fools all along." Ilara's response was not to offer words of comfort or absolution. Her response was action. She handed Martha a steaming mug of broth. She placed another log on the fire. She checked on the sick boy, laying a hand on his forehead. Her grace was not in forgiveness. It was in her quiet, unwavering competence. It was in the simple, profound act of providing. "There is stew," she said to Gable, her voice even. "Eat. Your family is safe here." In that moment, she was not the outcast. She was the center of the world, the keeper of the fire, the one who had listened to the mountain instead of to the foolish whispers of men. When the great freeze finally broke, it left a changed world in its wake. The town of Providence Gulch was battered, humbled. They had lost livestock, homes, and a dozen people to the cold. But from the devastation, a new story emerged. It was the story of the widow on the scour, the woman who had built a house of stone and wool that had held firm when oaken logs had failed. The survivors she had sheltered, Brant and Gable's family, carried the tale back with them. They spoke of the deep, radiant warmth of the ingenious design, of the quiet strength of the woman who had built it. The mockery ceased overnight. The name wool-packed walls was no longer an insult. It became a term of respect, a name for a new kind of wisdom. People began to make the journey up to her homestead, not to stare or to pity, but to learn. They came with questions, their hats in their hands. They looked at her composite bricks, at the way she had built into the hillside to use the earth's own heat, at the simple genius of her insulation. Ilara, who had been cast out, was now a teacher. She shared her knowledge freely, without triumph or bitterness. She explained the principles of thermal mass and wind sheltering as if they were simple common sense. The town began to rebuild, but they did not rebuild in the same way. The new structures that rose from the ruins were different. They were built lower to the ground with thick walls of stone and clay. Some were built into the south-facing hillsides, mimicking Ilara's design. The lessons learned from her survival were etched into the very architecture of the reborn town. Providence Gulch became known not for the silver that had once promised riches, but for its resilience, its strange and sturdy homes that could withstand the worst the winter could throw at them. Mr. Gable never regained his former status as the town's oracle. The freeze had broken his pride permanently. He became a quieter, more thoughtful man, one who was slow to judge and quick to listen. He ran his mercantile, but his pronouncements on sense were gone, replaced by a humble deference to those who had proven their wisdom through action. He ensured that Ilara never wanted for supplies, a silent, unending repayment of a debt that went far beyond shelter. Ilara never moved back to town. The scour was her home, the place where she had forged a life from nothing. She expanded her home, adding a small greenhouse against the western wall, using panes of glass salvaged from the town's broken buildings. She grew vegetables year-round in the protected space. Her flock of sheep grew. Her homestead, once a symbol of folly, became a landmark, a testament to the power of one woman's refusal to be broken. Her story traveled, carried by trappers and traders, becoming a frontier legend, the tale of the widow who had tamed the wind. Years later, an old woman with hands as tough as leather and eyes as clear as the winter sky would sit on a bench outside her home. The dog at her feet was a descendant of Boulder, just as steadfast and loyal. She would look out over the valley at the town of Providence Gulch nestled below, its chimneys sending up plumes of smoke into the crisp air. She had been given nothing but a worthless piece of rock. She had been left with nothing but scorn and pity. But from that rock she had built a foundation. With that scorn as fuel, she had built a fire. She had created not just a shelter, but a legacy not of technique, but of character, a quiet, enduring testament to the simple, profound truth that what the world discards, a wise heart can make the cornerstone of a new world.